In the small town of Riverdale, two strangers were about to cross paths in a way that would change their lives forever. A waitress named Tessa, working double shifts just to keep her sister in college, down to her last dollar. And James, a homeless veteran with secrets buried deeper than the medals he no longer wore. What happened when Tessa gave away her final dollar might seem like a simple act of kindness. But sometimes, the universe has a way of balancing the scales. "I can't take your last dollar," James had protested that cold October night. "How did you know it was my last?" Tessa asked, surprised. "I know what struggle looks like," he answered softly. Neither of them could have imagined what would unfold 3 days later, when military vehicles would roll into town, when long-buried secrets would surface, when justice would finally arrive in the form of an elite military unit seeking to right a wrong years in the making. This is a story about karma, about how a single moment of compassion can set in motion events that expose corruption, reveal stolen identities, and return stolen honor. About how the universe sometimes waits for the perfect moment to balance its books. And it all began with $1. The sun had barely risen over the sleepy town of Riverdale when Tessa Rivera pulled her worn-down Honda into the cracked parking lot of the Blue Plate Special Diner. At 26, the lines around her eyes suggested someone much older, etched there by years of early mornings and late nights. She checked her phone. 5:42 a.m. Another double shift awaited. She pulled her auburn hair into a neat ponytail and applied a quick dab of concealer under her eyes. The mirror reflected back a face trying hard to appear put together despite everything crumbling beneath the surface. Behind the reflected image, a final notice for rent payment was visible in the passenger seat. "Just get through today," Tessa whispered to herself. "Just one more day?" The diner stood as it had since the 1970s, its neon sign flickering pathetically, much like the hope in Tessa's heart. She inserted her key into the back door and turned it with practiced precision. The familiar smell of grease and coffee grounds welcomed her as she flipped on the lights. As she tied her apron around her waist, Tessa mentally calculated what remained in her bank account. $87.32 needed to stretch until next Friday. Her phone buzzed with a text from her younger sister, Maya. "Got the midterm results. Aced it. Prof says I should consider the advanced program. Extra $600 for the summer semester, though." Tessa smiled despite herself. She typed back, "That's amazing. So proud of you. Don't worry about the money. We'll figure it out." She placed her phone down and took a deep breath. Maya was her everything. After their parents died in that car accident 3 years ago, Tessa had put her own college dreams on hold to make sure her sister could finish. She would find the $600 somehow. The morning rush came and went. Truckers on their routes, early shift factory workers, and the regular crowd of retirees who gathered to debate local politics over endless cups of coffee. Tips were meager, as usual. Tessa kept a mental tally, $23.50. Not great, but not terrible either. Around 10 a.m., she spotted him through the window. A figure hunched on the bench across the street. James Nixon was there, like clockwork. James had appeared in Riverdale about 8 months ago. No one knew much about him except that he was a veteran. His weathered army jacket still hung from his broad shoulders despite the fraying edges. At 62, his face told stories his lips never would, deeply lined and permanently tanned from what must have been years under harsh suns. His silver hair was always neatly combed despite his circumstances, and his piercing blue eyes seemed to see right through people. The first time Tessa had noticed him was during a frigid January morning. While other businesses had chased him away, she had brought him a steaming cup of coffee. She never asked questions, and he rarely offered information. But in their silence grew understanding. Today, James looked particularly ragged. His usual stoic expression had given way to something Tessa recognized all too well: hunger. "Taking my 10. Tessa called to Dolores, the other waitress on shift, as she poured a cup of coffee and plated some leftover scrambled eggs and toast. Outside, the October air had a bite to it. Tessa crossed the street, carefully balancing the food. "Morning, James," she said, offering her usual smile. James looked up, surprise momentarily flashing across his face. "Miss Tessa," he nodded, the formal address a remnant of military habits. "Thought you might want some breakfast," she said, handing him the plate. "You shouldn't keep doing this," he said, even as his hands trembled slightly taking the offering. Nonsense. They were just going to throw it out anyway. It wasn't entirely true, but James had his pride. They sat in comfortable silence as James ate with the careful precision of someone who knows hunger too well to rush a meal. "Your sister graduate yet?" he asked between bites. James never forgot details. "Not yet. One more year to go," Tessa smiled. "She's thinking about an advanced program now." James nodded. "Smart kid. Takes after her sister, I bet." Tessa laughed. "Smarter. She got all the brains. And you got all the heart," James replied, with rare emotion in his voice. Tessa's 10-minute break stretched to 15, but she didn't care. These moments with James were reminders of humanity in a world that often felt indifferent to suffering. Back inside, the day continued its relentless march. By afternoon, disaster struck. Victor Mercer, the perpetually angry owner of the Blue Plate, called Tessa into his cramped office. Customer complained about cold eggs. He snapped, his round face red with what seemed like disproportionate anger. "That's the third complaint this month." "I'm sorry, Mr. Mercer." The kitchen was backed up, and "I don't want excuses," he cut her off. "I'm docking your pay. $20. $20 might as well have been $200 to Tessa. But she couldn't afford to argue. Not with rent due and Maya's additional tuition looming. "Yes, sir," she managed, swallowing her pride. The afternoon crowd was sparse, and the tips reflected it. By the time her double shift ended at 8 p.m., Tessa had made just $41 in tips. Minus the 20 Victor had docked, she'd earned a mere $21 for 14 hours of work. She trudged to her car, feet aching and spirit low. When she turned the key, the engine made a sickening, grinding noise before falling silent. 3 attempts later, it was clear. Her car wasn't starting tonight. "Perfect. Just perfect," she muttered, resting her forehead against the steering wheel. After calling a tow service she couldn't afford, Tessa was informed it would be at least 2 hours before anyone could help. The October night, air was growing colder, and the diner was now closed. Across the street, she noticed James settling onto his bench for the night, arranging his few possessions neatly beside him. Without thinking, Tessa crossed over. "Car trouble?" he asked, noticing her distress. "Nothing ever breaks down at a convenient time, does it?" She attempted a laugh that came out more like a sob. James nodded sagely. "In my experience, convenience isn't something life concerns itself with much." Tessa sat beside him, suddenly too exhausted to care about social norms. "I don't think I can do this anymore, James," she admitted. "Do what?" "Any of it. Everything. I'm drowning here." James was quiet for a long moment. "When I was overseas," he finally said, "there were days I couldn't see a way forward. Too many obstacles. Too many enemies. You know what kept me going." Tessa looked at him. "One step. Just one single step at a time. You don't have to figure out the whole path. Just the next step." His words lingered between them as Tessa felt tears threatening. She quickly wiped them away. "Are you hungry?" she asked, changing the subject. "I make do," he replied diplomatically. Tessa reached into her pocket and pulled out a crumpled dollar bill, her last, and the wrapped sandwich she'd saved from her meal break. She'd been planning to eat it for dinner, but something told her James needed it more. "Here," she said, offering both to him. "It's not much, but—" James stared at her outstretched hand. "I can't take your last dollar." "How did you?" "I've been watching you count tips all week. I know what struggle looks like." Tessa pushed the offerings closer. "Please. It would make me feel better knowing you have something tonight." After what seemed like an eternity, James carefully took the sandwich and the dollar. "Thank you," he said, with a dignity that made Tessa's heart ache. "Your kindness. It matters more than you know." They sat together on that bench for nearly 2 hours, talking about everything and nothing. James shared fragments of stories from his military days, carefully edited to spare her the worst details. Tessa talked about her dreams for Maya and the photography career she'd once hoped to pursue. When the tow truck finally arrived, Tessa reluctantly stood to leave. "Good night, James." "Stay warm, okay." "Good night, Miss Tessa," he replied. "Remember, one step at a time." As she walked away, Tessa didn't see the thoughtful look on James's face as he carefully folded her dollar bill and placed it in a hidden pocket inside his jacket, right next to a faded photograph of men in uniform. She didn't see him unwrap half the sandwich and rewrap the rest for later. And she certainly didn't see him pull out a worn military ID card that he rarely looked at anymore. What Tessa also couldn't have known was that her simple act of kindness had set in motion events that would soon change both their lives forever. For now, though, she focused on James's advice, one step at a time. Tonight's step was figuring out how to get home without spending money she didn't have. As the tow truck driver gave her the bad news about her alternator, a $300 repair minimum, Tessa gazed back across the street. James had already disappeared into the shadows, taking with him her last dollar and carrying a burden much heavier than she could imagine. Morning arrived with the harsh reality of Tessa's situation. Her car remained at the mechanic's shop, held hostage by a $320 repair bill she couldn't afford. The walk to work took 40 minutes, and she arrived with damp shoes from the morning dew and an ache in her lower back that no amount of stretching seemed to help. "You're late," Victor Mercer announced the moment she stepped through the back door. At 58, Victor had the perpetually dissatisfied look of a man who believed the world owed him something. His thinning hair was meticulously combed over a balding spot, and his protruding belly strained against button-down shirts that were always one size too small. "I'm sorry, Mr. Mercer. My car broke down and I had to walk." "Not my problem," he cut her off, checking his gold watch, a flashy piece that seemed at odds with the struggling diner he owned. "That's 30 minutes deducted from your pay." Tessa bit back a retort. She needed this job, no matter how insufferable Victor had become since taking over the diner 3 years ago. Rumor had it he'd bought the place with a mysterious windfall, though the business had been declining steadily under his management. "Yes, sir," she replied, tying her apron with trembling hands. Another financial hit she couldn't afford. The morning passed in a blur of coffee refills and forced smiles. During a rare lull, Tessa checked her bank account on her phone. The car repair would leave her with nothing for rent. Maya's tuition payment was due in 2 weeks. The walls felt like they were closing in. "You look like you could use this more than me today," Dolores said, sliding a $5 bill across the counter. At 64, Dolores had been working at the Blue Plate since before Tessa was born. "I couldn't," Tessa protested, though her eyes lingered on the money. "Take it, honey. My Social Security check came yesterday. I'm flush this week." Dolores winked, though they both knew that was far from true. Reluctantly, Tessa pocketed the money. "I'll pay you back. I promise. You just keep being you." "That's payment enough," Dolores said, before shuffling off to serve a young couple who'd just been seated. By noon, Tessa realized she hadn't seen James in his usual spot across the street. A flicker of worry crossed her mind. Temperatures had dropped into the low 40s last night, but she pushed the concern aside. James had survived worse. He told her stories of winter nights in Korea that made Riverdale's cold snaps seem like summer days. The lunch crowd was unusually busy, a small blessing that meant better tips. As Tessa cleared table 7, she overheard a conversation that made her pause. "Caught him digging through the dumpster behind my store," a man was saying. Tessa recognized him as Ray Tompkins, owner of the hardware store 2 blocks down. "That homeless vet told him to get lost or I'd call the cops." His companion, another local business owner, nodded sympathetically. "They're bad for business. Scare away customers with their begging." "James doesn't beg," Tessa interjected before she could stop herself. Both men looked up, startled. "He's a decorated veteran who served this country. Maybe he deserves a little more respect." Ray's face flushed. "Listen, sweetheart. When you own a business, you can decide who gets to loiter around it. When I see someone who's actually served their country with more than just talk, I'll let you know," Tessa replied, amazed at her own boldness. She collected their plates with deliberate slowness, ignoring Ray's sputtering response. The confrontation cost her a tip from table 7, but as she watched the men leave, Tessa couldn't bring herself to regret standing up for James. The afternoon dragged on, and still no sign of James. By evening, genuine concern had taken root. In the 8 months since he'd appeared in Riverdale, James had never missed a day at his bench. As her shift wound down, Tessa noticed Victor counting the register with unusual attention to detail. Normally, he rushed through closing duties, eager to leave for whatever entertainment awaited him in the larger neighboring town. "Everything balance out?" Tessa asked casually, wiping down a nearby table. Victor flinched, as if startled by her presence. "What?" "Yes, fine. Don't you have city work to finish?" Something about his defensive tone triggered a memory. 2 weeks ago, Tessa had been certain her tip jar contained at least $15 more than what she'd counted at the end of her shift. At the time, she dismissed it as a mistake in her mental accounting. Now, watching Victor's nervous fingers fumbling with the bills, she wasn't so sure. "All done," she said, keeping her voice neutral. "Just waiting on my last table to leave." Victor nodded distractedly, his eyes never meeting hers. When he disappeared into his office with the day's receipts, Tessa felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air seeping through the old building's windows. Her last table finally paid and left, leaving a decent tip. As Tessa collected it, she noticed a small paper that had fallen to the floor. Picking it up, she realized it was a receipt, but not from the diner. It was from Lux Motors in the neighboring town of Westfield. The receipt detailed a down payment on a new BMW. The customer name, Victor Mercer. The amount, $8,000. Tessa stared at the paper in disbelief. Victor drove a modest Honda and often complained about barely making ends meet. He'd cited financial struggles when cutting staff hours and refusing to repair the diner's aging equipment. How could he possibly afford a BMW? She pocketed the receipt, a queasy feeling settling in her stomach. After clocking out, Tessa decided to make a detour on her long walk home. Something drew her toward the small wooded area behind the public library, where homeless people sometimes camped. Victor's financial discrepancies momentarily forgotten, her concern for James took precedence. The October night had fully descended, and Tessa used her phone's flashlight to navigate the worn path into the trees. The sound of a crackling fire led her forward until she spotted a small circle of men huddled around a burning barrel. "Excuse me," she called out, keeping a safe distance. 3 weathered faces turned toward her. "I'm looking for James." James Nixon, a man in his 50s with a thick beard, gestured toward a tarp stretched between 2 trees. "Over there. Been sick since this morning." Tessa approached cautiously. "James?" "It's Tessa, from the diner." A weak cough answered her. She pulled back the edge of the tarp to find James curled on a thin bedroll, shivering despite the blanket wrapped around him. "Miss Tessa," he croaked, attempting to sit up. "You shouldn't be here." "Neither should you," she countered, kneeling beside him. His forehead burned with fever when she touched it. "You need a doctor." James shook his head firmly. "No hospitals. No doctors." The fear in his eyes suggested this was about more than the cost. "At least let me help you get somewhere warm," she pleaded. Another man approached, introducing himself as Dave. "He's been talking out of his head all day. Military stuff. Kept mentioning someone named Mercer." Tessa frowned. "Mercer? Like Victor Mercer? The guy who owns the blue plate?" James's eyes suddenly focused. "Victor Mercer," he repeated, with unexpected venom in his voice. "You work for Victor Mercer?" "Yes, unfortunately," Tessa confirmed, confused by his reaction. "James, what's wrong? Do you know him?" James struggled to sit up, his fever giving his eyes an unnatural brightness. "Kandahar. 2003, private military contractor. Left us to die when the ambush hit." His words came in staccato bursts, as if each one cost him precious energy. Tessa felt as if the ground had shifted beneath her. Victor was in Afghanistan. It was impossible to reconcile the image of her cowardly boss with any kind of military service. "Not service," James spat. "Profit. Blackwater type. Supposed to transport supplies. Took the money, left before delivery." His eyes closed momentarily, the effort of speaking clearly draining him. 3 men died, waiting for those supplies. Tessa sat back on her heels, trying to process this revelation. "Are you sure it's the same Victor Mercer?" James reached inside his jacket with trembling hands and extracted a weather-beaten photograph. In it, a group of soldiers stood beside a transport vehicle. James, 20 years younger but unmistakable, stood at attention. And there, at the edge of the frame, was a younger version of Victor Mercer, smirking at the camera. "He recognized me," James whispered. "First day I came to town. Saw him through the diner window. He knows who I am." A cold understanding dawned on Tessa. "Is that why you stay across from the diner? You've been watching him." James nodded weakly, trying to figure out what he's doing here. Man like that, always running from something. The pieces were beginning to fall into place. Victor's unexplained wealth, his aggressive reaction to James's presence, his apparent financial discrepancies. "James, I found something today," Tessa said, pulling out the BMW receipt. Victor's spending money he shouldn't have. A lot of it. James struggled to focus on the paper, then let out a bitter laugh that dissolved into coughing. Some things never change. Stealing again. Stealing? From who? Tessa asked, though she already suspected the answer. Check your tip jar lately? James asked, confirming her fears. A rustling sound from beyond the tarp startled them both. Dave appeared again, concern etched on his face. Someone's coming through the woods. Flashlights. James grabbed Tessa's wrist with surprising strength. Library computer. Tomorrow. Email address in my pocket. Colonel Reyes. Tell him I found Mercer. Tell him about the money. Before Tessa could respond, voices called out from the darkness. Police. Riverdale's finest, probably responding to complaints about the homeless encampment. Go, James urged. Back way. Behind the library. Can't be seen here. I'm not leaving you. Tessa protested. One step at a time, James reminded her. You're my next step now. Dave pulled Tessa to her feet. He's right. They'll just run you in for trespassing. There's another path. Come on. With a last reluctant look at James, Tessa allowed Dave to lead her away from the encampment, circling behind the library and emerging onto a side street just as police cruisers pulled up to the wood's edge. That night, in her tiny apartment, Tessa couldn't sleep. James's revelations about Victor churned in her mind. The email address James had mentioned was safely copied into her phone. Colonel Dominic Reyes, with a military extension. On her nightstand lay two pieces of evidence. The BMW receipt and a slip of paper where she'd been tracking her tips for the past month. The numbers didn't lie. If her calculations were correct, Victor had been skimming at least 30% off her tips for months, probably doing the same to all the waitstaff. Her phone buzzed with a text from Maya. Hey sis, got the financial aid paperwork. Need your signature as guarantor. Also, they need first payment by Friday. Love you. Tessa stared at the ceiling, tears of frustration burning her eyes. Victor's theft had directly impacted her ability to support her sister. And James, brave, honorable James, was suffering in the cold because of a man who had apparently built his life on betrayal. One step at a time, she whispered into the darkness, James's words becoming her mantra. Tomorrow, she would take that step. Toward justice, toward truth. Tomorrow, she would visit the library computer and contact Colonel Reyes. What Tessa couldn't know was that Victor Mercer had spotted her leaving the homeless encampment. Even now, he sat in his expensive leather armchair, drinking high-end scotch, contemplating how to handle the latest threat to the new identity he'd so carefully constructed. On his laptop screen was a bank account showing a balance of over $300,000, money siphoned from military contracts years ago, laundered through a series of businesses, including the Blue Plate Special. And in his desk drawer lay something that made his betrayal even worse. James Nixon's original military ID and discharge papers, which Victor had stolen years ago to prevent James from claiming his rightful benefits. The same documents he'd used to create false identities and access accounts that weren't his. As Tessa finally drifted off to sleep, the wheels of justice had already begun turning. Miles away, in a military office, an automated system flagged an unusual search query about Victor Mercer, triggering an alert on a case that had gone cold years ago but had never been closed. Dawn broke over Riverdale with unusual commotion. Tessa had just finished sending the email to Colonel Reyes from the library computer when she noticed the first military vehicle rolling down Main Street. Not one, but three olive-drab Humvees moved with deliberate purpose toward the center of town. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Had her message actually reached someone who cared? That seemed impossible. She'd only sent it 40 minutes ago. Tessa hurried outside, watching as the small convoy parked directly in front of the Blue Plate Special. From the lead vehicle emerged a commanding figure in full military dress uniform. Colonel Dominic Reyes stood tall at 52, his posture ramrod straight, eyes scanning the surroundings with tactical precision. Behind him, 8 soldiers deployed with practiced efficiency. Secure the perimeter, Colonel Reyes ordered, his voice carrying across the morning stillness. Nobody enters or leaves until we complete our objective. Tessa approached cautiously. Colonel Reyes? His sharp gaze turned to her. You must be Tessa Rivera. How did you know? I only just emailed. We've been tracking James Nixon for years, he explained, lowering his voice. Ever since he disappeared after his identity was stolen. Your email wasn't the first contact. It was the confirmation we needed. Understanding dawned on Tessa. James has been in contact with you. Sporadically. Using public computers, burner phones. He's been hunting Victor Mercer for nearly 7 years. We've been building a case. Before Tessa could respond, a commotion erupted from inside the diner. Victor Mercer burst through the front door, his face ashen when he spotted the military presence. Without hesitation, he bolted toward the alley. "Runner!" shouted one of the soldiers. 2 military police officers cut off Victor's escape route with practiced precision. He stumbled backward, eyes wild with panic. "Victor Mercer," Colonel Reyes announced, closing the distance between them. "You are being detained on suspicion of theft of military identity, embezzlement of government funds, and dereliction of duty resulting in casualties." Victor's bravado crumbled instantly. "This is some mistake. I'm just a small business owner." "Save it," Colonel Reyes replied coldly. "We found your offshore accounts and the paper trail connecting you to James Nixon's stolen benefits." Local police cruisers arrived, lights flashing. The small town of Riverdale had never seen such drama. Residents emerged from businesses, watching in stunned silence as Victor was handcuffed and read his rights. Tessa stood frozen, witnessing justice unfold with breathtaking speed. Then a thought struck her. "James, he's sick. In the woods behind the library." Colonel Reyes immediately dispatched 2 soldiers with a medic. "Get him stabilized for transport." 30 minutes later, Victor sat in the back of a police cruiser while officers executed a search warrant on his home. What they discovered confirmed everything. False identification documents, financial records of systematic theft, and a thumb drive containing classified military information he'd been selling to third parties. At the homeless encampment, James was carefully loaded into a military ambulance. Despite his protests, the medics insisted on immediate treatment for pneumonia. "Colonel," James rasped when Reyes approached his stretcher. "You finally got him." "We got him together, Master Sergeant Nixon," Reyes replied, using James's proper rank for the first time in years. "Your reconnaissance was invaluable." By noon, the diner had become an impromptu command center. Dolores and the other staff watched in amazement as military personnel combed through financial records, uncovering Victor's elaborate scheme. "He's been skimming from everyone," a young lieutenant informed Tessa. "You were right about your tips. But it goes deeper. He was laundering money through this business for years." Tessa sank into a booth, overwhelmed. "What happens now?" Colonel Reyes joined her, placing a folder on the table. "Justice happens now. For James. For you. For everyone Mercer has wronged." He opened the folder to reveal documents bearing James's name. Victor stole James's identity after their deployment together, used it to redirect his military pension, benefits, medals, everything. James has been owed over $450,000 in back pay and benefits. Tessa gasped. "Does James know?" "We're telling him now," Reyes confirmed. "But there's more." He produced another document, this one showing the diner's original ownership papers. The blue plate special never legally belonged to Victor. He forged the transfer documents. According to county records, the diner still belongs to its original owner, Florence Jenkins. "Miss Flo," Tessa whispered. Florence Jenkins had supposedly sold the diner to Victor before moving to Florida. No one had heard from her since. "We found her," Reyes said grimly. "Nursing home in Phoenix." Victor had been sending her small payments, just enough to keep her quiet. She thought she was receiving installments for the diner's sale. 3 days later, the blue plate special reopened. The sign on the door read, "Under new management." Inside, Tessa greeted customers wearing not a waitress uniform but a blazer. Florence Jenkins, now returned to Riverdale, had signed over the diner to joint owners, Tessa Rivera and James Nixon. At a corner table, James sat with Colonel Reyes, looking remarkably different after proper medical care, a haircut, and clean clothes. Though still recovering, his eyes had regained their sharp intelligence. "I still can't believe you used your last dollar to feed me that night," James said to Tessa during a quiet moment. "You had nothing, and you gave anyway. One step at a time, remember?" She replied with a smile. "I never imagined that step would lead here." The bell above the door jingled as Maya entered, carrying books and beaming. Since the events had unfolded, James had insisted on establishing a full scholarship fund for her education. "How's the advanced program?" James asked as she joined them. "Challenging. Amazing. Maya hugged her sister. All because of you too. Colonel Reyes raised his coffee cup. To justice served, he toasted. And to kindness repaid, James added, meeting Tessa's eyes with profound gratitude. Outside the window, where James had once sat watching the diner from across the street, a new bench had been installed with a simple bronze plaque. No act of kindness, no matter how small, is ever wasted. As afternoon sunlight streamed through the windows of the renovated diner, Tessa took a moment to absorb the transformation of her life. From struggling waitress to business owner, from desperate sister to provider, from someone who had given her last dollar to someone who could now give opportunities to others. The military convoy that had arrived in Riverdale had indeed changed everything. But the true catalyst had been a simple act of kindness, proof that even in the darkest moments, compassion could set extraordinary events in motion.